She was 20 years old when her father signed her name on a debt contract and handed her to a stranger as payment. No warning, no choice, just a date, a dress she didn't pick, and a man twice her age waiting at the end of a dirt road. The whole town of Redstone Valley turned out to watch, not to celebrate, but to stare. Because everybody loves a tragedy when it doesn't belong to them. What happened next shocked everyone, including Aveline herself. This is her story. Stay until the end, because nothing about it goes the way you'd expect. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Aveline Mercer got married, she burned the biscuits. She didn't mean to. She never meant to burn anything. Not the biscuits, not the small, careful life she'd been building inside her own chest for 20 years, quietly, privately, away from her father's debts and her mother's sighing and the particular cruelty of a town that had known your family's failures longer than it had known your name. But that morning she stood at the iron stove in the back of the Mercer house, staring at the smoke rising from the cast iron pan, and she did not move to fix it. She just stood there, hands at her sides, and let them burn. Her mother found her that way. Aveline, Ruth Mercer's voice came from the doorway, careful, thin, the way it always got when she was trying to manage something she didn't have the words for. The biscuits. I know. I know, Mama. Ruth crossed the kitchen and pulled the pan from the stove herself, setting it hard on the stone counter. The burned smell spread through the room like a verdict. She looked at the blackened biscuits for a moment, then looked at her daughter, and Aveline could see the thing her mother was carrying. That terrible mixture of guilt and practicality that parents wear when they've done something they cannot undo and have decided, in the quiet of their own hearts, that it was necessary. You need to start getting ready, Ruth said. Aveline turned from the stove. I am ready. Your hair is fine. Aveline, her mother's voice cracked on the second syllable, just barely. I need you to not be angry with me today. I'm not angry with you. That was a lie. And they both knew it. Aveline had been angry for 3 weeks, ever since the night her father came home from the bank with that specific look on his face, the one she'd learned to dread by the time she was 12. The look that meant something had been decided, something that would affect all of them, something that Elias Mercer had already made peace with in his own mind before he ever sat down to tell his family. He'd laid it out simply, the way he did everything. The farm debt, the note coming due, the bank's patience running out. And then the offer. Coulter Hayes, rancher, 35 years old, owner of the largest spread of land in the valley, had come to Elias with a proposition. He would settle the Mercer debt in full, every dollar. In exchange for Aveline's hand in marriage. Her father had said yes before he told her. She found that out later from her younger brother Dell, who had been listening at the door the way 12-year-old boys do, half for curiosity and half because some animal instinct told him this was important. He'd come to her room that night, sat on the edge of her bed, and told her in a low voice that didn't quite sound like his own. Pa already said yes, Linny. He told Mr. Hayes yes that same afternoon. Aveline had sat with that information for a long time without speaking. She understood what it meant, not just the practical arrangement. She was sharp enough to grasp that immediately. She understood the deeper thing it meant, the thing no one in her family would ever say out loud. That when the moment came, when the choice had to be made between the farm and their daughter's future, her father had not hesitated. He had looked at the scales in his mind and he had made the calculation, and he had signed. She was 20 years old. She had never been to Denver. She had never been kissed by a man she actually wanted to kiss. She had been planning, in the vague, ambitious way of girls who read too much and sleep too little, to find some way out of Redstone Valley. A job in a city, maybe, or a teaching position, something that would let her be her own person in a place where nobody knew her family's name as a synonym for financial embarrassment. All of that was over now. She got dressed on her wedding morning in the small room she'd slept in since she was 6 years old. The dress was borrowed from her mother, altered quickly, badly, by a neighbor woman who'd done her best with limited time and limited fabric. It was pale yellow, not white. Aveline had specifically requested not white. She wasn't sure why, exactly. Something about honesty, maybe. Something about not pretending this was something it wasn't. Her reflection in the small, cloudy mirror above the washstand looked back at her. She was not a vain woman. Her mother had made sure of that, had treated prettiness as a kind of moral failure. but she knew she was not unpleasant to look at. Dark hair, dark eyes, a jaw that her father had always called too stubborn, and her grandmother had called strong. She was slim in the way of women who worked hard and didn't have enough to eat, not in the way of women who were pampered and corseted. She looked at her reflection for a long moment. "You're going to survive this," she told herself. "That's all you have to do. Survive." The wedding took place at the small church on the eastern edge of town, which was the only church in Redstone Valley, and therefore not a choice but a given. Aveline rode into town in the back of the family wagon, with her mother beside her and Dell up front with their father. The morning was cold, early November, the sky the particular flat gray of a valley. Winter settling in. And she kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the familiar buildings of Redstone Valley pass by. The dry goods store, the post office, the saloon that her father was banned from, the feed barn, the hotel where traveling salesmen stayed. She had grown up here. She knew every face, every front porch, every story, and she knew, with a certainty that sat in her stomach like a stone, that every one of those faces would be there this morning. Not out of goodwill, out of appetite. Because a debt marriage in a small frontier town is not a private affair. It is a public performance, a piece of theater that everyone in the audience understands completely, and no one will ever discuss directly. She was right. The churchyard was full. They were standing in clusters. Women in their good coats, men with their hats in their hands, children that shouldn't have been brought but were anyway, because nobody wanted to miss this. When the wagon came down the main road, Aveline felt the shift in the crowd, the subtle collective movement of 200 people turning their attention onto one specific person. She kept her face still. Her mother reached over and pressed her hand once, briefly, and then withdrew. Elias Mercer stopped the wagon and climbed down without a word. He helped Ruth down, and then he held out his hand for Aveline, and she looked at it for a second longer than was comfortable before she took it and stepped down onto the cold dirt. The walk to the church door was perhaps 40 feet. It felt like a mile. She heard their voices. Not loudly, people had enough social grace to keep it to murmurs. But in the quiet of a windless November morning, murmurs carry. Mercer girl. Debt marriage, I heard. Hayes must have wanted a young one. Poor thing. That last one came from a woman she recognized, Nora Whitfield, who had 3 daughters of her own and a husband who drank quietly instead of loudly, which apparently made him respectable. Poor thing. Said with genuine sympathy, which was somehow worse than mockery, because sympathy meant they had already decided who she was in this story. The tragic girl. The one who didn't get a choice. Don't, she told herself, don't look at them. Don't give them anything to remember. She walked into the church with her head up. Coulter Hayes was already there. He was standing at the front of the church, beside the minister, and when Aveline walked in through the doors, he turned and looked at her. That was the first time she saw him clearly. She'd seen him before. Redstone Valley was not large enough for a man of his prominence to be a stranger. But she'd never looked at him directly. Not like this. Not with the understanding that this was the man her life was being handed to. He was taller than she'd remembered. Lean, not in the way of a man who'd gone without, but in the way of a man who worked hard and didn't stop moving. Dark hair with the first gray coming in at the temples. A jaw that had seen more sun than a razor lately. His face was not unkind. That was the thing she noticed first and couldn't quite account for. She had been preparing herself for something harder, something that matched the word transaction that kept circling in her mind, and instead she found a face that was simply tired. Weathered. A man's face. Not a cruel one. He was wearing a dark coat that fit him well. He had made an effort. She noticed that too. Their eyes met for a moment. His expression didn't change, didn't soften into the false warmth people put on for public occasions, didn't harden into anything that would have confirmed her fears. He just looked at her, steady, and gave a single small nod. Like he was acknowledging something, like he understood what this was and what it cost her, and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She filed that away and said nothing. The ceremony was short. The minister, Reverend Cass, was a decent enough man who had the good sense to keep things brief when brevity was merciful. The vows were standard. Aveline said the words she was supposed to say. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. Beside her, Coulter said his own vows in a low, even voice, like a man making an agreement he intended to keep. When it was done, he did not try to kiss her in front of everyone. He offered her his arm to walk out. That was it. She took his arm because she didn't know what else to do, and they walked back down the aisle together, and she felt the eyes of the entire town on her back like heat from a fire, and she kept walking, kept her shoulders level, kept her face composed. Outside in the churchyard, her mother hugged her with the tight, desperate grip of a woman who is trying to transfer her regret through physical contact. Her father shook Coulter's hand. Dell stood to one side looking at his shoes. Then, in the way of these things, it was over. And she got into a different wagon. Coulter Hayes Ranch was 6 miles northeast of Redstone Valley, up into the hills where the land rolled and the juniper grew thick and the wind came down off the higher mountains with a cold edge even in autumn. The drive took a little under an hour. They made it mostly in silence. It was not a hostile silence. Aveline had been bracing for hostility, had been cataloging in her mind all the ways a man with power over a woman could make that power felt. The sharp remarks, the cold dismissiveness, the small cruelties that are impossible to name but impossible to miss. She'd watched enough marriages in Redstone Valley to have a full vocabulary of quiet suffering. Instead, Coulter Hayes drove his wagon in silence and let her keep hers. Once, about halfway through the drive, he said, "Are you cold?" She was, a little. The November wind was coming down hard off the hills. "I'm fine." He reached behind the wagon seat without looking at her and produced a folded wool blanket. He held it out. She took it, unfolded it, laid it across her lap. The wool was heavy and smelled like cedar and horse and something else she couldn't name. "Thank you," she said. That was the whole conversation. The ranch appeared as they came over a low ridge. She saw the main house first, a long, solid structure of pine logs and river stone, not elegant but substantial, built to last. Behind it, at a distance, a barn twice the size of her family's entire property, and beyond that a series of smaller outbuildings she couldn't identify yet. Corrals along one side, a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter, the earth turned over, the beds covered with straw. A windmill, a well with a stone surround. It was not what she had imagined. She wasn't sure what she had imagined exactly. Something more austere maybe, something that would match the transaction she'd been handed. Instead, the place had the particular quality of somewhere that had been steadily, quietly cared for over a long period of time. Not a showplace, a home. Someone had planted the 3 cottonwood trees along the south side of the house, had tended them over years until they were large enough to provide shade in summer. Someone had built the stone wall along the garden in a way that was more careful than strictly necessary. She found herself looking at the cottonwoods as Coulter brought the wagon to a stop. "This is it," he said. "Simple. Not proud. Not apologetic. Just factual." "It's bigger than I expected," she said. 1,200 acres. Runs up to the timberline on the north side." He climbed down from the wagon and came around to her side. He offered his hand. She took it and stepped down. His grip was firm and impersonal, and he released her hand as soon as she was on the ground. "I'll show you the house," he said. "Then I'll let you settle. I've got work to finish before dark." "All right." She followed him to the front door. The inside of the house surprised her again. It was clean. That was the first thing. A single man's house in the middle of ranch country, and it was clean. Not spotless, not the performance of cleanliness, but the real thing, the kind that comes from habit and personal preference rather than anticipation of visitors. The floors were swept. The windows, though clouded with November, had been recently wiped. There was a fire laid in the stone fireplace, not yet lit, ready to go. The main room served as a combined living and eating space, with a heavy wooden table capable of seating 6 and 2 chairs near the fireplace, one of which was positioned beside a small table with a lamp and a stack of books. "Reading chair, Secte," he read. She noticed that. The kitchen was along the back. A proper iron stove, a long counter, shelves of preserved jars in rows. A door leading out to what was probably a root cellar. Everything orderly, functional. He led her through a short hallway to 2 doors. He opened the first one. "This is yours." She looked in. A bedroom, a real one. Not large, but not small either. A proper bed with an iron frame, a mattress that wasn't straw, a quilt that had been pieced together from dozens of different fabrics, a washstand with a basin, a window looking north toward the hills, a small chest of drawers, a hook on the back of the door, and empty, entirely, pointedly empty of any of his things. She looked at the room, then she looked at him. "The other room is mine," he said. His voice was even, matter of fact. "You have this one. The lock works." He paused. "I want you to know that." She didn't say anything for a moment. "There's a key on the washstand," he added, and then he looked away toward the window, as if something outside required his attention. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything. Supper's usually around 6. He left. She heard his boots on the floorboards, the front door, the quiet of the house after. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long time, looking at the key on the washstand. It was a small iron key, unremarkable. She walked over and picked it up. It was cold from the room's unheated air, heavy for its size. She turned it over in her palm. She thought about what it meant that a man who had, by any reasonable legal interpretation of frontier marriage, acquired considerable authority over her, had led with this, with a locked door, with a key she could keep. She didn't know what to do with that. She sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress gave under her in a way that her narrow straw mattress back home never had. She sat there in her borrowed yellow dress in the middle of the room that apparently belonged to her now, in a house at the end of a dirt road in the Redstone Hills, and she pressed the iron key against her palm until she could feel the exact shape of it. She did not cry. She was a Mercer, which meant she was accustomed to dealing with circumstances rather than feelings. Feelings were for later. Circumstances were for now. She got up, unpacked the small bag she'd brought, 2 dresses, a nightgown, her mother's old hairbrush, 3 books, and hung her things on the hook. She washed her face in the basin. She changed out of the yellow dress and folded it carefully because it was her mother's. She put on her ordinary dress and her heavy work apron, the one she'd packed because instinct told her that whatever this life was going to be, it was going to require work. Then she went to find the kitchen. Supper was an interesting problem. She had been cooking since she was 8 years old. She was competent, not inspired. She could produce food that was solid and nourishing, if not particularly interesting. But this was a stranger's kitchen, a stranger's stores, a stranger's preferences. She didn't know what he liked or what he had or what his habits were. She opened the pantry and took stock. Flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, a side of bacon wrapped in cloth, potatoes, onions, dried herbs she couldn't fully identify, a tin of coffee, another of tea, preserves in the cellar she'd need to inventory later. She made beans and salt pork with cornbread. Basic. Filling. The kind of food that makes no claims. He came in at 6 precisely. She heard the creak of the door, the knock of his boots. He took them off in the entryway, which she noted because it was a detail that said something about a person. He came into the kitchen in his socked feet and stopped when he saw the table set and the food out. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." He sat. She sat. They ate. The fire was going by then. She had lit it when the temperature dropped, and it crackled in the silence between them, which was company of a sort. Halfway through the meal, he said, "Beans are good." "They're just beans." "Good beans, though." She looked at him. He was eating steadily, with the focused appetite of a man who had worked hard all day and needed fuel. He wasn't performing gratitude. He just meant it. "Thank you," she said. They finished eating. She cleared the table. He poured himself coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway while she washed the dishes. Not in a supervising way, just present. "I get up at 4:30, he said. "If you don't want breakfast ready, don't worry about it." "I'll be up." "You don't have to." "I'll be up," she said again, without turning from the wash basin. A pause. "All right," he said. Then he went to his chair by the fire, picked up one of his books, and read. She washed the dishes. The first 3 nights, she locked the door. She told herself it was precaution, not distrust. She wasn't sure that was entirely honest, but it was the version of things she could live with. She lay in the big bed in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch at night. The wind off the mountains, the horses moving in the barn, the occasional protest of some piece of timber or roof settling under the cold. Sounds she didn't know yet. The auditory geography of a new place takes time to learn. He never tried the door. She had half expected him to. Not because of anything he'd said or done. He had said nothing and done nothing to justify the fear. But because fear is not always rational, and she had been given to understand by the general tenor of her world that men with power over women found ways to use it. She was waiting for the other shoe. It didn't drop. On the fourth night, she left the key on the washstand and didn't lock the door. She wasn't entirely sure what that meant. She lay there for a while trying to analyze it and then decided she was tired of analyzing things and went to sleep. The town didn't leave her alone. She'd known it wouldn't. You don't make yourself into a public story and then slip out of the public's attention just because you've relocated 6 miles up the road. Redstone Valley had its teeth in the Mercer girls' marriage, and it was not going to let go. It came in various forms. The most direct was the supply run. Every 2 weeks, Coulter loaded the wagon and drove into town for what couldn't be produced or preserved at the ranch. Aveline went with him the second time because she needed thread and couldn't communicate exactly what kind without going herself. The dry goods store was owned by Martin Fossey, a round, amiable man who had always been fair in his dealings with the Mercers even when their credit was thin. He greeted her normally, called her Aveline the same way he always had, asked what she needed. That was fine. It was after, outside, while she waited for Coulter to finish at the feed barn. 2 women came out of the millinery next door. She knew them. Agnes Hollis, wife of the most successful cattle broker in the valley, a woman who wore her social position the way other women wore jewelry, visibly and with intention. And beside her, Della Pryor, whose husband owned the hotel, and who had the particular skill of making ordinary conversation sound like an insult. They saw Aveline. They stopped. There was a moment, half a second maybe, in which the situation could have gone politely. Could have been 2 women who had once been neighbors in passing, now briefly crossing paths on the main street of a small town on a cold November morning. Then Agnes Hollis smiled. "Aveline Mercer," she said. "Or I suppose it's Aveline Hayes now, isn't it?" "It is," Aveline said. "Well..." Agnes looked her over with the particular efficiency of a woman who can assess another woman's entire financial and social situation in under 3 seconds through clothing alone. "You're looking settled." "I am." "How is life up at the Hayes Ranch?" Della asked. She had wide, pleasant eyes and a way of asking questions that made them sound like they were about one thing when they were obviously about another. "It's good," Aveline said. "Busy." "I imagine it must be a change," Agnes said. She made a small gesture that somehow managed to encompass the entirety of the Mercer family's financial history. "Well, after everything..." "It's a change," Aveline agreed. She kept her voice flat. "Give them nothing." "Coulter Hayes is..." Agnes paused, as if searching for the right word with exquisite care. "Well, he got what he wanted, didn't he?" It wasn't quite a question. Aveline looked at her. "I'm sorry." "A young wife. Someone to manage the house." Agnes's smile didn't waver. "I suppose it works out well for everyone." "My family is out of debt," Aveline said. "Yes, it worked out." "Of course." Agnes touched her sleeve. "And we all think it's just wonderful that Elias found a solution." The way she said solution, like Aveline was a problem that had been neatly disposed of. Coulter's wagon came around the corner of the feed barn. "That's my husband," Aveline said. She walked to meet him, and she kept her back straight and her head up and her hands loose at her sides, the way she'd walked down the church aisle, and she did not look back at Agnes Hollis or Della Pryor. She climbed up to the wagon seat before he could come around to help. He looked at her face when he got up on the other side. He looked at it the way he seemed to look at most things, attentively, without rushing to interpretation. Something in her expression must have said enough for today because he turned the wagon toward the road without a word. They were halfway out of town before she said, "Do you know Agnes Hollis?" "Well enough," he said. "She's unpleasant." A long pause. "She's unhappy," he said. Aveline thought about that. "That's not an excuse." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Winter came down into the valley hard and fast, the way it did every year, but somehow always surprised people anyway. The first real snow fell in the second week of November, a good 6 inches overnight, and Aveline woke to it and stood at her bedroom window looking out at the transformed landscape. The white hills, the dark lines of the fence posts, the smoke rising straight up from the barn where Coulter had already been working for 2 hours. She pulled on her heaviest dress, added her mother's old wool shawl on top of it, and went to start the kitchen fire and put the coffee on. He came in at 7, stomping snow off his boots in the entryway, his face red from the cold and his breath coming out in clouds. "Pipe in the south trough froze," he said. "Going to be a long day. Sit down. I'll get your coffee." He sat. She brought the coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at her over the rim of it, and she couldn't read his expression exactly, but there was something in it that wasn't impatience or criticism, more like assessment, the look of someone revising an estimate they'd made earlier. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early." "You don't have to be." "I know." She sat down across from him with her own mug. "What do you need done today?" He looked at her. "I can work," she said. "I'm not decorative." Something shifted in his expression, a very small shift, but she was beginning to learn the range of Coulter Hayes' face, which was not large but was not dishonest. "I know you're not decorative," he said. "I never thought you were." "Then tell me what needs doing." He was quiet for a moment, turning his mug in his hands. Then he said, "I need someone to keep the fire going in the barn and break the ice on the water troughs every 2 hours. It's not complicated, just cold." "I can do that." "I'll give you the heavy mallet. The ice is—" "I know how ice works," she said. "I grew up here." He almost smiled. She wasn't entirely sure. It was a subtle change around the corners of his mouth, gone quickly. But she thought he almost smiled. "All right," he said. "Finish your coffee first." She broke ice for 6 hours that day. The work was not pleasant. The temperature dropped through the morning, and by midday it was cold enough that her breath frosted her scarf, and the mallet handle was painful to grip without her heaviest gloves. The horse barn was warmer than outside, but still cold enough to ache in, and the cattle barn was worse, larger, less insulated, the animals themselves providing some warmth, but not enough. But she did it. Every 2 hours, the troughs, the mallet, the cracking and scooping of ice. In between, she kept the barn fire fed, learned the names of the horses because she asked and Coulter told her. The big gray was General, the black was 3, the roan mare was Tuesday for a reason he didn't explain, and watched how a man managed a ranch in a crisis with no extra hands and a freeze coming down off the mountains. He didn't waste motion. That was what she noticed. He moved from one problem to the next with a kind of methodical economy that had nothing to do with hurry and everything to do with knowing what had to happen and in what order. There was something almost restful about it, watching someone be competent. At one point in the afternoon, fixing a section of fence where the snow weight had brought a post down, he handed her an end of wire to hold taut while he wrapped it, and she held it, and they worked the repair together without discussion, and when it was done he tested the tension with one thumb and nodded. "Good," he said. 2 letters, but she filed them away the same way she'd filed away the key on the washstand. Washette. The evenings became their own kind of pattern. Supper, the table, the fire, his book, her mending or her own book, the horses settling in the barn, the wind outside and the warmth inside. It was not comfortable exactly. There was still the background tension of strangeness, of 2 people who had not chosen each other learning the geometry of shared space, but it was not hostile. He did not speak much. She had always found silence more honest than noise, so she did not require him to fill it. Sometimes he would say something unexpected. One night, midway through December, she'd been reading a novel, one she'd had for 2 years, borrowed from the lending shelf at the post office, and never quite gotten around to returning. And she'd laughed at something in it, a short, involuntary sound she immediately self-censored. She looked up to find him watching her from across the fire. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing, just—" She turned the book so he could see the cover. "Have you read this?" He looked at it. "No? It's—" The author is very funny in a way that's also completely devastating. It's hard to explain. "What happens?" She looked at him, surprised by the question. He was watching her with that quiet attentiveness, the same kind he gave to a piece of fence or a horse with a problem foot. She told him, not the plot exactly, but the part she'd just read, the scene that had made her laugh, explaining the character and the situation and why it landed the way it did. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Sounds like a person I knew," he said. "Which part?" "The part where he can't tell his own pride from his principles." She looked at him. That was more personal than anything he'd said to her in 7 weeks. It arrived in the room and hung there for a moment. "Can most people tell the difference?" she asked. "I think most people choose not to look hard enough to find out." She thought about that for a long time after she went to bed. She visited her family twice before Christmas. Both times Coulter drove her in and waited at the feed barn while she spent an hour with her mother and Dell, and once, briefly, her father. Elias Mercer had aged in those weeks, or she was looking at him differently, which amounted to the same thing. He sat in his chair by the family fire and asked her careful questions. "Are you well? Are you getting enough to eat? Is Hayes decent to you?" And she answered carefully, because the honest answer was something she didn't have language for yet. "He gave me a locked door and a key. He lets me work. He told me something true about himself without meaning to." None of that translated into something her father could receive without discomfort. "He treats you well?" Elias asked. "Direct this time." "He does," she said. "Also direct." Her father looked at his hands. Then he looked at her. The thing he was carrying was there in his face, visible. That compound of shame and relief and love that a parent wears when they've traded their child's peace for their family's survival and are trying to decide what they are because of it. She didn't help him. She wasn't ready to help him yet. "The debt is cleared," he said. "All of it." "I know." "Aveline?" "I know, Papa." She stood up. "I need to get back. Coulter will be waiting." She hugged her mother and Dell and left. On the drive back up the hill, the valley spread out below them in the late afternoon winter light. The town, the fields, the dark line of the river, the hills going blue in the distance. She looked at it and tried to locate the feeling that should be there, the grief of the life she didn't get, the mourning for the exit she'd planned. It was there. She wasn't going to pretend it wasn't, but it was quieter than she'd expected. She wasn't sure what to do with that either. On Christmas Eve, she found a package on the kitchen table. She'd come in from feeding the chickens. She'd taken over the chickens in the second week because they needed someone in the morning, and Coulter was always already deep in the barn work by the time they needed feeding. And it was sitting there wrapped in brown paper with her name written on it in handwriting that was careful and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone who didn't write often but was trying. She stood there for a moment. Then she unwrapped it. It was a pair of work gloves, the heavy, supple leather kind, not the rough, cheap ones, the kind that took a real hide and real craftsmanship to make properly. They were the right size, exactly the right size. She thought about when he could have measured her hands and decided it must have been observation alone, and that he had been paying enough attention to know. Inside the left glove, there was a small piece of paper for the ice work. CH. She sat down at the kitchen table, still in her coat, and held the gloves in her lap. He was not a man who expressed things in words. She was beginning to understand that. But he expressed them in other ways. In the key on the washstand, in letting her work beside him, in asking what happened in her book. In gloves that fit. She was not in love with Coulter Hayes on Christmas Eve of her first winter at the ranch. But she was beginning, slowly, carefully, the way ice melts from the edges first, to understand that he was a good man. Not a perfect one, not easy or warm or naturally communicative, but a man who kept his word, who saw her as a person with a measure of accuracy that embarrassed her when she thought about it, who had given her a house that could become a home if she let it. She put the gloves on. They fit exactly right. She wore them that afternoon when she went out to break the ice on the troughs, the cold cracking down off the mountain and the snow coming again. And every time she swung the mallet, she felt the weight of the handle against the good leather, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that surviving was not the only thing available to her here. That was the first time the thought arrived clearly, and she held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile in the cold. The winter was not over, but it was perhaps halfway through. January came in like a fist. The temperature dropped to places the thermometer on the barn wall struggled to register, and the wind off the northern ridge stopped being weather and started being something more personal, something that found the gaps in your coat, in your thinking, in whatever you'd been telling yourself about how you were doing. Aveline learned in the first week of the new year that winter on a working ranch was not the same thing as winter in town. In town, winter was an inconvenience. Out here, it was an opponent with intentions. She got up every morning at 4:15 now, 15 minutes before Coulter's alarm, because she had decided without saying so that she would not be the person in this arrangement who needed to be waited on. The kitchen fire first, then the coffee, then the water for oats, and by the time he came down the hallway in the dark, she had the stove going and the room warm enough to think in. He never commented on it. He just sat down and accepted the coffee the way a man accepts something he has decided to trust. And they sat in the early dark together, not talking much, the fire doing most of the work. It was in those mornings, the cold ones, the ones where the windows were frosted solid, and the only evidence of the world outside was the sound of the wind, that Aveline began to understand something about Coulter Hayes that she couldn't have understood from a distance. He was not a man made for small talk or for the performance of feeling. What he had instead was a quality she didn't have a clean word for, a kind of steady, undemonstrative presence. He was simply there, fully and without condition. And after a winter of being in that presence, she began to recognize how rare it was. Her father had always been somewhere between here and his next problem. Even in his best years, Elias Mercer was a man whose attention leaked away from the immediate moment, distracted by what he owed or what he planned or what he feared. She had grown up with that particular loneliness, the loneliness of being in the same room as someone whose mind was always somewhere else. Coulter was always where he was. She didn't know yet if that was a quality or just a fact about him, but she kept noticing it. One morning in mid-January, nursing her second cup of coffee while he laced his boots, she asked him something she'd been turning over for weeks. "Why did you do it?" He didn't look up from his boot. "Do what?" "The arrangement. With my father." She kept her voice even, matter of fact, because she was asking for information, not a fight. "You could have hired a housekeeper. You could have done without. Why take on a wife you didn't know?" He finished with the boot, sat back, looked at her across the table with those level, unhurried eyes. "I've been working this ranch alone for 9 years," he said. "That's not an answer." "It's part of one." He picked up his coffee mug. "Your father came to me, not the other way around. He needed someone to help him, and I'd been thinking about whether this place needed something different than what it had." He paused. "That sounds cold," she said. "It sounds cold." "Maybe." He set the mug down. "I'm not going to lie to you and say I was swept off my feet by the idea of you specifically. I didn't know you. I knew your family's situation. I knew you were 20 and educated and practical, and I knew what this ranch needed." It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in 2 months, and she appreciated it and resented it simultaneously, which seemed to be the mode this marriage operated in. "And what about what I needed?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. "I thought about that," he said. "I'm not sure I got it right." She looked at him. He held her gaze, didn't look away, didn't offer anything additional. Just that. "I'm not sure I got it right." Said the way a man says something true when he doesn't have anything more comfortable to offer instead. She picked up her mug. "At least you thought about it." "For what it's worth, more than nothing," she said, and she meant it, and she let the conversation end there. February brought a thaw. Brief, false, the kind that tricks the ground into softening before the cold comes back and freezes everything again harder than before. Coulter called it the January lie, even though it came in February, because his father had called it that, and his father's definition was good enough. In the false thaw, she asked him to teach her to ride properly. She knew the basics. Every girl in a frontier valley did, out of necessity. But she knew them the way you know something you've only ever had to do badly in an emergency. Coulter had 6 horses, and she'd been relying on the wagon or her own feet to get anywhere, which was impractical, and she knew it, and it irritated her. He took her out to the paddock on the first dry morning with the roan mare Tuesday, and he showed her how he wanted her to hold the reins. Not death-gripping them, not loose and careless, but present. "You're having a conversation," he said. "You're telling her things through your hands. She needs to feel you thinking." Horses don't read minds. They read hands. Same thing, mostly. He adjusted her grip without asking permission, just moved her fingers into the right position, practical and impersonal. His hands were rough from the cold and the work, the kind of rough that came from decades of use. He stepped back. Now walk her. Don't push. Let her find the pace and then match it. She walked the mare around the paddock. Tuesday was not a difficult horse. She was settled and sensible, the kind of mare that tolerated uncertainty in her rider without taking advantage of it. But Aveline could feel what he meant about the conversation. There was a dialogue happening through the reins, a back and forth that required attention. She came around the paddock twice, then a third time with more confidence. When she pulled up, Coulter was leaning on the fence post with his arms crossed, watching with that same careful attention he gave everything. "Better," he said. "Don't patronize me." "I'm not. First 2 rounds you were bracing. Third one you stopped." She looked at him. He was right, and she knew it. "What changed?" "You stopped waiting for her to do something wrong." She thought about that. "Is that a metaphor for something?" "It's a thing about horses," he said, and walked back toward the barn. She stayed out for another hour, alone with the mare, working the paddock until her thighs ached, and the cold came back down off the hills. She didn't stop when it started. She stopped when she felt the thing he'd described. The conversation, the mutual attention, the not waiting for something to go wrong, settle into the way she was sitting, and she could hold it without trying. By March, she could ride anywhere on the property. She started doing the east fence checks on Tuesday, saving him 3 hours every other day. He didn't tell her to do it. She just did it, and he adjusted his own schedule around it without comment, and that was how they worked out the division of things. Not by agreement, but by each person moving into whatever space needed filling. The gossip didn't stop. She had known it wouldn't, but she'd hoped the physical distance of 6 miles would dilute it. It didn't. Redstone Valley was small enough that distance only meant the gossip arrived slightly delayed and slightly exaggerated. It came to her through her mother, who tried to report it gently and failed because Ruth Mercer had never been able to deliver bad news gently, only apologetically. "People are saying things," Ruth told her on one of her visits, in the low voice she used for things she didn't want Dell to overhear. "Agnes Hollis has been talking at the socials about the arrangement." "What specifically?" Aveline said, because she was not interested in vague distress, only concrete information. "That your father essentially sold you." Ruth pressed her lips together. "That Coulter Hayes bought himself a young housekeeper and dressed it up as a marriage." Aveline was quiet for a moment. "And what do people think of that?" "Some people think it's shameful for your father. Some people think it's—" Ruth stopped. "Say it." "Some people think you're lucky, that you latched onto the best propertied man in the valley before anyone else could." Ruth looked at her hands. "I'm sorry, Linny." "Don't be sorry. I needed to know." Aveline looked out the window at the familiar street. "It doesn't change anything." "It doesn't bother you?" She thought about that honestly. "It bothers me that it's the only story they can see," she said. "I bother them because I don't fit the version they've decided on. If I look miserable, I'm proof that it was tragic. If I look all right, I must be calculating." "You are all right, aren't you?" Her mother looked at her with naked worry. Truthfully, Aveline considered the question, the real one, not the social one. The true accounting. The early mornings, the ice work, the horses, the evenings by the fire, the Christmas gloves, the conversation about pride and principles, the way Coulter had looked at her and said, "I'm not sure I got it right." "I am," she said, truthfully. "I don't know exactly what it is yet, but I'm all right in it." Her mother reached across and squeezed her hand. "That's more than a lot of women can say." "I know," Aveline said. "That's the part that bothers me most." Spring came late and badly, the way it often did in the valley. A grudging concession from the weather, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Mud season before green season. The ground heaving up rocks that had been underground all winter as if the earth was clearing its throat. She planted the kitchen garden in April, earlier than most would have risked it. Coulter watched her turning the beds from the barn doorway one afternoon, and came over after a while with his coffee, and stood beside the turned earth looking at the rows she'd laid out. "You've done this before," he said. "Every year since I was small. My mother's garden. You've expanded it." She looked at the beds. She had in fact added 2 rows on the south end. I hope that's all right. It's your garden. She looked at him. He meant it plainly, not as a legal statement about property, but as a simple acknowledgement of fact. She was the one who worked it. It was hers. She turned back to the soil. I want to add fruit trees, she said, along the south side of the house. Apples, maybe a couple of pears. Ground's good for it there. I know. I checked the drainage. He looked at her with that expression she'd started calling his revising look. The one she'd noticed that first morning with the coffee, where he was quietly updating whatever assessment he'd made earlier. She'd come to find it less irritating and more reassuring. It meant he was paying attention. It meant his idea of her was built from observation, not assumption. I'll get the trees from Harrow's when I go for supplies, he said. Make a list of what you want. She made the list that evening at the kitchen table, looking up varieties in the one farming almanac he owned, cross-referencing with the climate notes in the back. He sat across from her reading his own book, and every once in a while she'd ask him something. How deep does the frost get on the south side? Does that slope drain toward the house or away? And he'd answer without looking up, and she'd go back to her list. It was so ordinary that she almost missed what it was. A married couple at a kitchen table in the evening, one with a list, one with a book, talking without the weight of having to talk, like people who had arrived together at some place that had no name but was comfortable to be in. She put down her pencil and looked at him. He was reading. His glasses, reading glasses he only used at home, wire-rimmed, slightly bent on the left side, sat low on his nose. There was a tension in his jaw that was always there, she'd noticed, the kind that comes from years of managing things alone, of being the last line of problem-solving. She wondered if it ever relaxed fully. She wondered if he knew it was there. Coulter? He looked up. Thank you, she said, for the trees. He studied her for a moment. You don't have to thank me for things that are reasonable. I know I don't have to. She held his gaze. I'm doing it because I want to. He looked back at his book, but the tension in his jaw was slightly different after that, and she filed it away the same way she filed away everything. The key, the gloves, I'm not sure I got it right. Dell came to visit in May, riding out on the family's one decent horse with a note from their mother, and what appeared to be no other purpose than to see the ranch and eat something other than whatever Ruth was producing that week. He was 13 now and had grown 2 inches since the wedding, all of it in his legs, so he looked slightly unfinished, like a foal that hadn't quite sorted out its own proportions. Aveline fed him lunch and showed him the property while Coulter worked the northern pasture. Dell asked questions about everything, the horses, the well, the smokehouse, the way the barn was built, with the particular appetite of a boy who was young enough to still find other people's lives fascinating rather than threatening. Is he good to you? Dell asked eventually. They were at the paddock fence watching Tuesday move in the field. Who, Coulter? Yeah. She leaned on the fence. He is. Dell digested that. People in town say, I know what people in town say. I'm not asking what they say, I'm asking you. She looked at her brother. He was watching her with those dark eyes that were her father's eyes, but hadn't yet acquired her father's particular brand of evasion. He was still at the age where he looked at things directly and expected direct things back. He's a fair man, she said. He works hard. He tells me the truth even when it's not comfortable. She paused. He treats me like I have a brain, which is more than I can say for most of the men in that town. Dell nodded slowly. You seem different. Different how? He thought about it with the seriousness of a 13-year-old who is trying to say something real. Less like you're waiting for something to go wrong. She looked at him. That was accurate in a way that surprised her coming from a 13-year-old boy. I'm still waiting, she said honestly. I'm just doing other things while I wait. Dell grinned. That sounds like you. Coulter came back from the north pasture that afternoon and found Dell in the barn asking questions about the horses. And instead of being put out by the intrusion, he spent 40 minutes explaining the bloodlines of the 3/4 horses he kept for cutting work, in more detail and with more evident interest than Aveline had ever heard him use about anything. She stood in the barn doorway and watched her husband talk to her little brother about horses, and found, with a small private surprise, that something in her chest was softer than it had been in November. She didn't name it. She wasn't ready to name it. But she knew it was there. The gossip found a new angle in May when someone, she suspected Della Pryor, who had the particular talent of knowing things she shouldn't, spread the information around town that Aveline had been seen doing fence work and ice breaking and barn maintenance alongside her husband. The story that came back to her via her mother via a conversation at the dry goods store was that people felt this was evidence of exactly what they'd suspected, that Coulter Hayes had purchased himself a farm worker, not a wife, that she was being used for labor, that it was, if anything, worse than they'd thought. She heard this and sat with it for a while, feeling the particular frustration of a story that can only be read one way, regardless of what is actually true. She was working because she chose to. She was working because it made the days meaningful, because the physical labor of the ranch was the first thing in her adult life that produced clear, visible results. The fence stood, the garden grew, the horses were healthy and fed. She was working because being useful in a real way was better than the decorative uselessness that women in town were praised for. She was working because Coulter never asked her to, and that made it hers. None of that fit into the version of the story Redstone Valley was interested in telling. She mentioned it to Coulter that evening, not because she needed him to fix it, but because she was tired of carrying things silently, and she'd found that saying them out loud in this kitchen, to this man, made them smaller. "People think you're exploiting me," she said. "The labor thing." He set down his book. "Do you think that?" "No?" "Then it doesn't matter what they think. It matters to me that they're wrong and I can't correct it." He was quiet for a moment, that jaw tension working. "What would you say to them, if you could?" She thought about it. "I'd say that I'm not a victim of this arrangement, and I never was. I made a choice. Not the choice I would have made freely, maybe, but once it was made, it was mine to live, and I've been living it on my own terms." She looked at him. "But they don't want that story. The interesting version is the tragic one." Coulter looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You know what I notice about the people in that town who talk the most?" "What?" "They're all sitting still. Same chair, same house, same opinion they had 10 years ago. You're moving." He picked up his book. "Let them talk. People who aren't moving always watch people who are." It was, she thought, one of the most useful things he'd ever said. She went back to her mending with a slightly lighter feeling, and the fire crackled between them, and outside the May wind came down off the hills smelling faintly of the snowmelt in the new grass, and the ranch held its quiet breath around them both. She did not think of it as happiness. Not yet. She was too careful for that, too accustomed to things having conditions. But she sat in that kitchen with the man she hadn't chosen, and the fire he'd laid, and the coffee that was always right, and the garden that was hers. And she allowed herself, carefully, provisionally, the way you test ice before putting your full weight on it, to consider that she had been wrong about what this life could be. She had walked into this house certain she was entering another kind of prison. What she had found instead was harder to name, but real. A space that was hers. A man who kept his word. A life that was demanding and cold and imperfect and, in the particular way of things that ask everything of you, more fully hers than anything in the easier life she'd planned. The apple trees went in along the south side of the house in the second week of May, 4 of them, in holes she and Coulter dug together one long Saturday morning, while the dogs ran the fence line and Tuesday watched from the paddock with her usual mild interest. The dirt was cold still, deeper down. Winter hadn't entirely let go its grip. And by the end of the morning, her back ached and her hands were dirty to the wrists, and she was sweating in the spring sun despite the chill. Coulter tamped the last tree in, tested it for stability, and stood back. "They'll take a few years," he said. "I know. By the time they fruit, we'll have been here a while." It was a simple statement, logistical, about trees and time. She looked at him anyway. He was looking at the trees, not her. His profile against the spring sky. The angles of his face, the gray coming in more at the temples now, the squint he had from years of looking at distance. "We'll have been here a while." "Yes," she said. "We will." He picked up the shovel and walked back to the barn, and she looked at the 4 small trees in their new earth, and she pressed one hand briefly against the cold dirt around the nearest one. The way you press your hand to something you want to remember. The season was turning. The ice was gone. The valley was green again. She went inside to start supper. The social was Agnes Hollis's idea. as most things in Redstone Valley were when they required an audience. It was held on the second Saturday of June, in the yard behind the town hall, tables set out with checkered cloth, pies and preserves on display, the children running the perimeter while their mothers arranged themselves into the specific social formations that small towns require. It had happened every summer for as long as anyone could remember. One of those community rituals that persisted not because people loved it, but because skipping it meant something, and nobody wanted what skipping it meant. Aveline had not attended the previous year's social. She had been 3 weeks into the marriage then, still finding her footing in the ranch house, still waking in the night to sounds she hadn't learned yet. She told herself it was practical. Too much to do. Too far to drive. Too early to face the collective gaze of the town. But the honest accounting was simpler. She hadn't been ready. She'd needed time to become something other than the girl who'd been handed over at the church door before she stood again in front of the people who'd watched it happen. 7 months had passed since then. The apple trees were in the ground. She could ride Tuesday across 1,200 acres without thinking about it. She knew the ranch's sounds in her sleep, knew the difference between a horse moving in discomfort and one moving in boredom, knew which board on the back porch creaked and which floorboard in the hallway spoke and which window stuck on damp mornings. She had made herself at home in a place she hadn't chosen, and that had taken something from her and given her something back in return that she was still in the process of identifying. She decided she was ready. She told Coulter at breakfast on the Friday before, "I'm going to the summer social tomorrow." He looked up from his eggs. "All right. I'd like to take the wagon myself. You don't have to come." A pause. Something moved across his face, not objection, but consideration. "I've got the north fence to finish," he said. "I can come after, if you... I'll be fine on my own." He looked at her the way he did when he was deciding whether to push something. "Aveline." "I need to go as myself," she said, "not as your wife who you accompanied into town, just as a person who lives 6 miles up the road and came to the social." He set down his fork. "Those aren't mutually exclusive things." "I know, but they'll treat them like they are." She held his gaze. "If you're beside me, everything I say or do reflects on you and them deciding whether to accept you standing by me. I need them to deal with me directly." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the protectiveness that she'd observed in him, the practical understanding that she was right, the tension between those two things. He was not a man who made easy peace with leaving problems alone. The ranch had taught him otherwise. You see a problem, you fix the problem. She was not a problem he could fix by standing next to her. "I'll have the wagon ready by 9, he said finally. "Take the gray. He's steadier on the main road." "Thank you." He picked up his fork. "If it goes badly, then I'll come home and we'll have supper and I'll deal with it the same way I deal with everything else." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not made of paper, Coulter." He met her eyes. "I know exactly what you're made of," he said, quietly enough that it didn't sound like a compliment or a criticism, just a plain true thing, and went back to his breakfast. She arrived at the social at 9:30, tied the gray to the hitching post along the south side of the town hall, and smoothed her dress. The good one, the dark blue wool she'd bought with her own money from 3 weeks of selling eggs in town, altered to fit properly by her own hand this time, not a neighbor's rushed approximation. She had done her hair carefully that morning, the way her mother's mother had taught her, pinned back but not severe. She looked like a woman who had made an effort without begging for approval, which was exactly what she intended. The yard was already full when she came around the corner of the building. She felt the shift in the social atmosphere before she saw the faces. That particular change in the air of a gathering when a specific person arrives and people recalibrate. It was subtle, the way these things always were in public, but she had grown up in this town, and she could read its frequencies. Heads turned. Small conversations paused and restarted with a different direction. She was registered, categorized, discussed in the span of 4 seconds without a single word being said to her directly. She kept walking toward the tables. Her mother found her within a minute, coming across the yard with the determined walk of a woman intercepting something. Ruth Mercer looked well, better than she had in November, the debt weight off her face, the particular tired fear that Aveline had watched calcify in her mother over years visibly reduced. It was the thing she held on to when the arrangement felt most like a wound. Her mother looked like she could breathe again. "You came," Ruth said, pulling her into a brief, tight hug. I told you I would. I know, but she lowered her voice. Agnes is here. She stopped. Just be careful. I'll be fine. Linny. Mama. Aveline squeezed her hand. I'm fine. Where's Dell? Dell was, predictably, with the other boys near the horse corral, engaged in whatever competitive pointlessness 13-year-old boys occupied themselves with at public events. Aveline found him, exchanged a look that communicated several things without words, and moved on into the social with a purpose she kept internal and a posture she kept open. The first hour was manageable. She spoke to Martin Fosse's wife, Clara, who had always been decent to her, and was decent now, asking about the ranch with genuine curiosity rather than social excavation. She spoke to old Hector Mills, who ran the smithy, and had shod Coulter's horses for 20 years, and greeted her with a warmth that was clearly an extension of his regard for Coulter, but was offered freely anyway. She tried a piece of Vera Lawton's apple cake, and told Vera honestly that it was the best cake she'd had in months, which was true, and Vera turned pink with pleasure, and that exchange alone made the drive worth something. She was at the preserves table, examining a jar of something dark and unidentified, when Agnes Hollis arrived. She didn't arrive alone. Della Pryor was with her, and a third woman Aveline didn't know well. Marian Cass, the minister's wife, who had the faintly pained expression of a woman who was always slightly aware that whatever was about to happen was going to be uncomfortable, and had decided long ago to attend anyway. Aveline Hayes. Agnes's voice carried the precise amount of social warmth required to be technically civil. I wasn't sure we'd see you. I said I'd come. Aveline set down the jar and turned. You look well, Agnes. Thank you. Agnes let her gaze travel briefly, clinically, over Aveline's dress, her hair, her face. It was a complete assessment delivered in under 2 seconds with the precision of a woman who had spent decades calibrating other women. Ranch life seems to agree with you. You've gone quite brown. Sun will do that. We don't usually see women of... Agnes paused. Property, working the fences and such. There it was. The angle, the entry point. The careful insertion of the narrative that Agnes had apparently been constructing in Redstone Valley's collective conversation for the past 7 months. Aveline heard it clearly. Women of property, with its implication that Aveline was not, in fact, property, but was being used like it, that any woman working fences must be working them against her will or beneath her dignity. I work because I choose to, Aveline said. Turns out I prefer it to sitting still. Della made a small sympathetic sound. Of course, though I do hope, well, Coulter Hayes is a capable man. He shouldn't need his wife to... He doesn't need me to, Aveline said. I do it because it's my land and I care how it runs. Agnes smiled. That particular smile, thin, precise, with something behind it that was not amusement but was dressed as amusement. Your land. That's one way to think of it. Aveline looked at her. What's another way? Well, Agnes folded her hands in front of her, a gesture of exquisite patience. We all understand the arrangement. Elias needed relief from his debts, and Coulter needed... She tilted her head. Help around the property. Everyone got what they needed. There's no shame in it, really. These things happen. The yard was not silent. There were 30 other conversations happening around them. But this particular circle had acquired the quality of density that a gathering gets when something real is being said. Marian Cass was looking at the tablecloth. Della was watching Aveline with those wide, pleasant eyes, waiting. Aveline breathed in through her nose. She felt the heat rise in her chest. Not panic, not humiliation, something harder than that. Something that had been building since November, since Solutions and Poor Thing, and got what he wanted, since every version of the story that made her either a tragedy or a transaction and left no room for the person who had actually been living it. She looked at Agnes Hollis, at the careful hair, the good coat, the folded hands, the smile that had probably been sharpened over years into exactly this instrument, and she said, clearly and without raising her voice, I think you've spent more time thinking about my marriage than I have. Agnes blinked, just slightly. What Coulter and I are to each other isn't something you've witnessed, Aveline continued, so I'm not sure where you got your information, but I'd be curious to know, since you seem very confident in your understanding of our arrangement, as you call it, What exactly you think you know? She paused. Specifically, the silence in the circle pulled tighter. I only meant, Agnes started. I know what you meant. Aveline kept her voice even, conversational, as if they were discussing the price of flour. You've been telling people my husband bought me, and that I'm essentially hired help with a ring on my finger. I've heard it 3 or 4 times in 7 months, from different mouths, which means it came from one source. She looked at Agnes without blinking. You should know that the story you're telling reflects less on me than you think. Della had taken a small step backward. Mary and Cass had found something very interesting to look at in the middle distance. Agnes held her ground. She had the social armor of a woman who had never in her life been directly confronted with her own behavior in public, and it was thick. But something in her expression had shifted, a slight recalculation happening behind the careful face. I meant no offense, Agnes said. The voice was cooler now. The smile was gone. I know, Aveline said. That's the worst part about it. She picked up the jar of preserves she'd set down earlier, looked at it, set it back. Enjoy the social, Agnes. She turned and walked away. Her legs were steady. She was grateful for that. Her heart was moving fast in her chest. She was not, as she had told Coulter, made of paper, but she was made of something with a pulse, and the pulse was going. But her walk was even and unhurried, and she went back to Clara Foss in the conversation about winter planting, and she stayed in it with her whole attention until the heat in her chest subsided to something manageable. Clara Foss, she noticed, had been watching from across the table. When Aveline rejoined her, Clara reached over and briefly pressed her arm once, without saying anything about why. Aveline nodded and accepted it and kept talking about turnips. She left the social at 2 o'clock, which was earlier than she might have otherwise, but she had done what she came to do, and she was carrying something heavy now, and she wanted to carry it somewhere private. The drive back up to the ranch was 6 miles, and she made it in the particular kind of silence that follows something that cost you energy you didn't know you were going to spend. The gray moved steadily on the familiar road. The valley spread out on either side. Summer full now, the grasses tall, the hills green to the tree line, the sky that deep blue that only existed in the mountains at altitude. She ran through the conversation in her mind, not with regret. She didn't regret it. It needed to be said. She had said it the way it needed to be said. But with the reflexive analysis she brought to everything, checking the angles, seeing where she'd been right, where she'd been sharper than necessary, where she hadn't been sharp enough. The thing she hadn't anticipated was how much it would hurt. Not the confrontation itself. She had prepared for that, had known some version of it was coming, but the part underneath it, the part Agnes Hollis had pressed on without meaning to, the question of what it actually was, what she and Coulter actually were to each other. Because Agnes had been wrong in all the ways that were visible, but she'd been close to something true in one invisible way, that Aveline herself was still not sure what she'd call it. She pulled the wagon into the ranch yard and unhitched the gray, and she was leading him to the paddock when Coulter came out of the barn. He took in her face. He was good at reading her face now. Better than she'd expected him to become. Better than most people in her life had been. He read it in about 2 seconds. How bad? He said. Agnes Hollis? He was quiet. He took the gray's lead from her hand without asking and led the horse through the paddock gate. She leaned on the fence and watched him check the horse over, giving him water, checking the feet out of habit. Always the feet, every time, without fail, because that was the kind of man he was about things in his care. When he came back out and latched the gate, she told him. All of it. She told it straight, the way she told him everything. Without performing distress, without underplaying it, just the facts of what had been said and what she had said back. He listened without interrupting. His hands were still on the fence post by the end of it. You said that to her, he said. Yes. In front of people. In front of Della Pryor and Mary and Cass and whoever else was close enough to hear, which in Redstone Valley means everyone will know by Monday. He was silent for a moment. She couldn't read what was moving across his face. It was doing something more complicated than usual, cycling through things she didn't have names for yet. Good, he said. She looked at him. I should have... He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. I've been letting it go on too long, thinking if I ignored it, it would find something more interesting to do. He looked at her steadily. That was wrong. It was wrong of me to leave you to manage it alone. She felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically. It was not a large visible thing, but it was real, the way real things are. I didn't need you to manage it, she said. I know you didn't. That's not what I meant. He turned to look at the paddock, where the gray was already settled with his water. I meant that you shouldn't have had to. Those people aren't just bothering you because of who you are. They're bothering you because they think I don't care enough to make it worth their while to stop. She looked at the side of his face. What are you going to do? He was quiet for a long moment. She knew that look, the methodical interior inventory of a man who was working out a problem from first principles. The same look he gave a broken piece of equipment or an ailing animal. Nothing rushed, nothing skipped. I need to think about it, he said. Coulter, I need to think about it right, he said, not fast. She accepted that. He was not a man who did things fast when the situation asked for precision, and she had learned in 7 months that his slow thinking was more reliable than most people's quick thinking. They went inside. She made coffee. He sat at the table with the look still on his face, and she left him to it, because that was also something she'd learned. When Coulter was working on something internal, the most useful thing you could do was not interrupt. He drank his coffee. She started supper. The ranch settled around them in its evening rhythms, the horses quieting, the birds finishing their last runs at the feeders, the light going gold and then orange on the hills. At the table, eating, he said, "Did it do any good?" "What you said to her?" Aveline considered. Marion Cass pressed my arm after. That was something, and Clara Fossey. A couple of other people were close enough to hear, and I think some of them were glad someone said it. She pushed food around her plate. Agnes wasn't sorry, she was just recalibrating. That's what I thought. She'll find another angle. Yes, he said. She will. She looked at him. You can't stop people from talking. I'm not interested in stopping people from talking. He set down his fork. I'm interested in making the thing they're saying irrelevant. How? He looked at her across the table. In the evening light, with the lamp between them and the windows going dark with the late sunset, his face was clearer to her than it had been in November. She knew it now, knew which lines were concentration and which were worry, and which were just his face's natural grammar. She knew the jaw tension and the reading glasses and the careful handwriting on a piece of paper inside a work glove. I have an idea, he said, but I need to be sure it's right before I say it out loud. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. But it's honest. She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her fork. All right. Outside, the summer dark was coming in off the hills, and somewhere up in the timberline, an owl had started its evening complaint, and the ranch held its breath around them the way it did, reliable and solid, the way things built carefully over a long time tend to be. She cleared the table. He refilled the coffee. He went to his chair by the fire, and she sat across from him, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet. Not the silence of strangers, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of two people who had run out of the need to fill space with sound. She thought about what Agnes Hollis had said. Coulter Hayes got what he wanted. And she thought about what Coulter had said in January. I'm not sure I got it right. And the distance between those two versions of the same man, and what it meant that one of them was true, and one of them was a story built by someone with too much time and not enough honesty. She thought about the apple trees along the south wall, 4 feet tall now, just beginning to show the attitude of trees that intended to stay. She thought about what it would mean to be irrelevant to have the gossip find nothing to stick to because the truth of the thing was already visible and solid and not interested in the story's opinion. She was not sure yet what Coulter's idea was, but she noticed it with a kind of careful, provisional clarity. She was curious, not afraid, not bracing for something to go wrong. Curious about what came next, about what he was working out in that methodical interior way of his, about what the man she had not chosen and had been learning for 7 months and was not done learning yet had decided to do. That, she thought, was different. That was something she hadn't felt since November, since the wagon ride up the hill, since the key on the washstand, since the first morning of 4:30 and coffee in the dark. She opened her book. The fire burned between them. In Redstone Valley, 6 miles down the road, talked its small-town talk into the summer dark, entirely unaware that something was being decided in the quiet. He didn't say anything about his idea for 3 days. She didn't push. She had learned the shape of his thinking by now. Learned that when Coulter Hayes went quiet about something, it was not avoidance but architecture. That he was building whatever he intended to do from the foundation up, checking each piece before he laid the next one. The ranch ran as it always ran. They got up at 4:30, drank their coffee in the dark, worked through the long summer days, ate together at the table, sat by the fire in the evening. She rode the east fence on Tuesday. He worked the herd on the north pasture. The apple trees grew their slow, patient inches along the south wall. But there was something different in those 3 days. A quality of intention in the house, the way the air changes before a storm. Not threatening, just charged. She felt it in the way he looked at her sometimes across the table, like a man who was measuring a distance and finding it smaller than he'd expected. On the third night, she was washing the supper dishes when he came and stood in the kitchen doorway. Not in his usual way, not the easy leaning posture of a man being present without purpose. He was standing straight, both hands at his sides, and when she turned and saw his face, she set down the dish in her hands and waited. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know. About the town, about what Agnes Hollis has been doing and what it's going to keep doing." He paused. "And about some things that aren't just about Agnes Hollis." She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth. "All right." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the very first day. Steady, direct, no performance of anything. But it was different now than it had been that first day in the church. She knew what was behind it now, or enough of it. "I need to ask you something first," he said, "before I tell you what I'm thinking." "Go ahead." "Are you staying?" She looked at him. "What?" "Here, with me. On the ranch." He said it plainly, without the particular carefully constructed casualness people use when they're afraid of an answer and trying to hide it. He said it the way he said most true things, straight, because he had decided that was the only way worth saying it. The arrangement was, it was what it was. Your father's debt, my offer. I've never pretended it was something more than that in the beginning, but it's been 8 months now, and I need to know if you're here because you feel you have to be, or because you want to be. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the summer night was in full voice. Insects, the horses, the owl somewhere up in the timber. She thought about the honest answer, the real one, not the practical one or the proud one. She thought about 4:30 in the morning and the key on the washstand and the Christmas gloves, and I'm not sure I got it right. She thought about a man who had watched her become herself in his house and had moved back to make room for it without being asked. "I want to be here," she said. "That took me a while to know for certain, but I know it now." Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not the way things shift in performances, but the way real relief moves across a person who has been holding tension for a long time and is only now allowing themselves to release it. "All right," he said. He came to the table and sat down, and she sat across from him, and he leaned forward with his forearms on the wood and looked at her directly. "Then I want to tell you what I've been thinking," he told her. She listened without interrupting. As he spoke, she watched his face and understood that this was not a spontaneous plan, but something he had built carefully over 3 days. Turned over, tested, discarded the parts that were wrong, kept the parts that were right. And when he finished, she sat with it for a long moment because it deserved that. "That's a significant thing to do," she said finally. "Yes. People will talk about it for years. They're already talking about it for years. I'd rather they were talking about something true." She looked at him. "You understand what you're saying. You'd be making a public declaration about us, about what this is. And the town will either respect it or they'll find some other way to twist it." "They'll respect it," he said. Not arrogant, just certain in the way he was certain about things he'd thought through completely. Because it won't be a thing they can reframe. The law is clear. Property transfer is recorded. Once it's done, and the record is public, and nobody in Redstone Valley or anywhere else can look at the legal register and tell you that what's yours isn't yours. She was quiet. "But that's not the whole reason," he said. "The legal piece it's the structure. The reason is different." He looked down at the table for a moment, the jaw tension working. "I told you in January that I thought about what you needed and I wasn't sure I got it right. I've been thinking about that since. He looked back up. I don't want you to be here because you're obligated. I don't want you working this land because you have nowhere else to go. If you stay, I want you to stay because you have something that's yours and you're choosing it. She held that carefully. That's a very different thing from what most men think about, she said. Maybe. He spread his hands on the table. I'm not most men. No, she said. You're not, Bob. She couldn't sleep that night. She lay in the bedroom, her bedroom, the one she'd had since the first day, the one with the key she'd stopped using months ago, and looked at the ceiling and turned it over. Not with doubt, not with the old fear that had kept her up in the early nights listening for the other shoe. With something more complicated than that, something that had her heart doing an unsteady thing in her chest and her mind moving fast around the edges of a feeling she'd been circling for weeks without letting herself land on it. She had told him she wanted to be here. She had meant it, but wanting to be somewhere and understanding what it meant to want it were two different things. And in the dark of the bedroom at 2 a.m, she finally let herself stop circling and look directly at what it was. She loved him, not in the breathless, consuming way of the novels she'd read, where love arrived like a weather event and rearranged everything. It had arrived in the way that things arrive when you've been paying close attention over a long time, slowly, accumulatively, in the pattern made by 100 small specific things. The gloves, the horses' names, the reading glasses bent on the left side, the way he moved through a problem with his whole attention, the jaw tension that never entirely released, the way he'd said, "I'm not sure I got it right," which was the truest and most valuable thing any person had ever said to her, because it was a man admitting fault without excuse and without theater. She loved him, and he had just told her that he wanted her to have something that was hers so she could choose freely, which meant he understood something about her that most people in her life had never bothered to look for, which made her love him more, which was a problem and also not a problem at all. She fell asleep around 3 and woke at 4:15 and got up and started the kitchen fire. The Sunday service in Redstone Valley happened in the same small church where they'd been married, and was attended by the same assembled social body of the town that attended everything else. Not out of particular devotion, but because the church on a Sunday morning was the one place where the entire town assembled under a single roof, and the entire town knew it, and that knowledge gave the place a weight that had more to do with community than with anything else. Coulter had not been to a Sunday service in 2 years. He had told her this matter-of-factly one winter morning when she'd mentioned it, in the same tone he used for ranch facts. The north pasture floods in heavy rain. The gray has a tender left front foot. I haven't been to Sunday service in 2 years. She hadn't pressed him on it. A man who spent his weeks in honest labor and dealt fairly with everyone he encountered had made his peace with the world in his own way, and she respected that. He went this Sunday. He told her the night before, the same way he told her practical things, without preamble. I'm going to the service tomorrow. I'd like you to come with me. She looked up from her book. Both of us. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. Is this the thing you were planning? Part of it. She closed the book. What's the other part? I'm going to speak. After the service. She was quiet. You have a right to know what I'm going to say before I say it, he said. I'm not doing this to you. I'm doing it with you if you're willing. She thought about that distinction. It was not a small one. Tell me, she said. He did. And this time, when he laid it out, she understood the full shape of it. Not just the legal piece, the property transfer, but what he intended to say in front of the assembled town of Redstone Valley, in the church where they'd been married, in the presence of every person who had spent 8 months discussing them. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You know they might not take it well, she said. Some of them won't. Agnes Hollis is going to be furious. Agnes Hollis is going to have to find something else to talk about. She looked at him. Something in her chest was doing the unsteady thing again. Why now? Because you went to that social alone and you handled it with more grace than it deserved, and you came home and told me about it without falling apart and without asking me to fix it, and I've been watching you do that for 8 months. Handle things that should not be yours to handle alone. And I am... He stopped. The jaw tension was pronounced. He was not a man for whom emotional articulation came easily, and she could see the effort it cost him, the particular struggle of a person reaching for language in territory they didn't usually inhabit. "I am tired," he said, "of watching you carry things alone that I should be standing beside you for." The kitchen was very still. "That's a good reason," she said. "I think so." She picked up her book, set it down again. "I'll come with you." Well, the church was full. It was always full on summer Sundays, but there was an additional quality to the fullness this particular morning, a density of attention that Aveline recognized from her own wedding day. That same collective awareness of something significant happening that a small town developed with the sensitivity of a body that shared one nervous system. She didn't know if word had gotten out that Coulter Hayes was going to speak. She suspected it had. Redstone Valley ran on information the way a mill ran on water, and Coulter had almost certainly spoken to Reverend Cass beforehand, and Reverend Cass had a wife. They came in together, she and Coulter, and she felt the room register them the way it always did, but differently than the wedding, differently than every other time she'd been visible to this town's collective gaze. She was not the Mercer girl being handed over. She was not the tragic young wife at the rancher's side. She was a woman who had worked 1,200 acres through a hard winter, who had planted trees that would outlast the current opinion of everyone in this room, who had told Agnes Hollis the truth in front of witnesses and walked away with her dignity intact. She sat straight. Agnes Hollis was in the third row on the right side, in her usual position of social prominence. Their eyes met briefly when Aveline and Coulter came down the aisle. Agnes's expression was controlled, professionally pleasant, the face of a woman who had decided in advance how she was going to handle today. They sat in the middle of the left side. Her mother was 3 rows back. Aveline caught Ruth's eye and gave a small nod, and Ruth nodded back. And beside her, Dell was already watching with the alert attention of a boy who understood more about what was happening than he was supposed to. The service was ordinary. She couldn't have told you afterward what Reverend Cass spoke about. She sat beside Coulter and felt the solidity of him beside her, the physical presence of a man who took up space without apology, who had come here with a purpose and was sitting with that purpose calmly the way he sat with everything. His knee was 3 inches from hers on the pew. She was aware of it. When the service concluded and the room began the shuffling transition toward the doors, Reverend Cass said, in his carrying voice, "Before we go, Coulter Hayes has asked to say something to the congregation. Coulter." The room stilled. Coulter stood. He was not a dramatic man, and he didn't arrange himself dramatically. He stood up from the pew and turned to face the room, and he waited for the noise to settle. And then he spoke in his ordinary voice, the voice he used for ranch things, for morning coffee conversations, for telling her the truth when it cost him something. "Most of you know why I'm standing up," he said. "If you don't, you will after. I'm going to be brief because I don't have a lot of patience for speeches, including my own." A ripple of uncertain laughter. He didn't acknowledge it. 8 months ago, Elias Mercer came to me with a debt problem and a proposal. I agreed to the proposal. Aveline, he looked at her directly in front of the entire assembled town, didn't get a say in it. That was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I agreed to it, and I told myself the reason I was doing it was practical and reasonable, and some of it was. But the part where she didn't get to choose was wrong, and I've known it since the first day. The room was very quiet. She came to my house in November with a borrowed dress and 1 bag, and the kind of backbone that most people never develop. She learned the ranch. She worked it. She chose to stay when she didn't have to. He paused. I want to be clear about that. She could have left. I told her that. The choice has been hers. Agnes Hollis was very still in the third row. What some people in this town have been saying, he said it without looking at Agnes, which Aveline thought was the more devastating choice, is that I bought myself a housekeeper, that what we have is a transaction, that she's working land that isn't hers for a man who owns her. Something moved across his face that Aveline had never seen there before, a controlled, precise anger, the kind that is more dangerous for being held in. I'm here to make that conversation irrelevant. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded document. This is a deed amendment filed with the county recorder's office on Thursday. It transfers the south quarter of the Hayes Ranch, 300 acres, including the house, the barn, the orchards, and all improvements on the property, into Aveline's name. Her name. Solely. Not both our names. Hers. He held it up briefly, then folded it and put it back. The filing is public record. Anyone who wants to verify it can go to the county office. The room was not silent now. It was that particular noise of 200 people recalibrating simultaneously, the collective intake and release of a community discovering that the story they've been telling is wrong. "I'm not doing this because I was pressured to," he continued. "I'm not doing it to impress anyone, and I don't expect a response from anybody in this room. I'm doing it because it's right, and because she has earned it, and because, whatever else is true about how we started, what I know now is that Aveline Hayes is the best partner I've ever had. And she doesn't belong to me. She belongs to herself." He sat down. The room held its breath for one full second. Then Aveline reached over, under the pew, and found his hand with hers, and held it. He didn't flinch. He turned his palm up and held her hand back, and his grip was firm and certain, the way he was firm and certain about things he'd decided. And they sat there in the pew in the church in Redstone Valley, hand in front of everyone who had ever made her into a story she didn't recognize. And she looked straight ahead and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since November. Not the absence of difficulty, not the end of complexity, just the specific, real, solid weight of someone being on your side completely and without condition. It felt different than she'd expected, simpler and heavier, both at once. Afterward, in the churchyard, the social geometry of Redstone Valley rearranged itself. Some people came to them, Hector Mills first, who shook Coulter's hand with both of his, and then, unexpectedly, nodded to Aveline with a depth of respect that made her throat tighten. Clara Fossey came and said quietly, "Good for him. Good for both of you." Martin Fossey stood behind his wife and looked at Coulter with the expression of a man who has revised his estimate of another man significantly upward. Others didn't come. Agnes Hollis left the churchyard early in the controlled, unhurried way of a woman who had decided she was departing on her own terms rather than being seen to leave. Della Pryor followed. Mary and Cass stayed. Aveline saw her standing at the edge of the gathering with a complicated expression that was not quite approval and not quite guilt, but contained elements of both. Her father found her near the fence. Elias Mercer had aged since November. She'd noticed it each visit, but it struck her freshly now, in the morning light, with the context of what had just happened. He was a man who had made a decision that had cost his daughter something, and had been living with the interest on that cost ever since. He looked at her with the same eyes Dell had, dark, her eyes, all three of them, and he looked like a man who had a number of things to say and was not sure any of them were adequate. "Aveline," he said. "Papa." He looked past her at Coulter, who was 15 feet away talking to Hector Mills. "He's a good man," he said, low, just for her. "I know," she said. "I've known it for a while now." Elias looked back at her. He stopped. The word he was reaching for was visible on his face, and it was a hard one for him, had always been hard. Her father was a man of practicality and deflection, not confession. "I know, Papa," she said. She didn't make him say it, not because she was giving him a pass, but because she understood that some things between people are understood without being spoken, and that understanding was its own form of grace that didn't require language to be real. He pulled her into a hug, brief and tight, the way he had when she was small and something had frightened her. She let him. When she came back to Coulter's side, he looked at her face and didn't ask. He just stood beside her in the way he'd learned to stand beside her, by present, not encroaching, available without demanding. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "Yes," she said. They walked to the wagon together, and her mother called goodbye from the fence, and Dell waved from somewhere near the horse corral, and the town of Redstone Valley watched them go with the various complicated expressions of a community that has just been shown a version of itself it wasn't entirely prepared to recognize. She climbed up to the wagon seat. Coulter climbed up beside her. The gray moved out onto the main road and the town fell behind them, and the hills rose ahead, green and blue and layered back to the mountains, and the summer air came down off the high places smelling of pine and distance. She still had the deed in her coat pocket. He had handed it to her in the church before they stood to leave, quietly, folded, the way you hand someone something that belongs to them. She could feel the weight of it, paper, legal language, 300 acres with a house and a barn and 4 apple trees that were her trees, in a way that nothing in her life had ever been hers. She didn't take it out, she just held it through the wool of her coat and felt it there. They were a mile out of town when she said, You didn't tell me you were going to say that, about being the best partner you'd ever had. He kept his eyes on the road. Relevant information. You could have told me ahead of time. If I told you ahead of time, you would have argued with me about whether it was appropriate to say in public. She considered that. He was right. That's calculating. It's efficient. She looked at the side of his face, the angles, the gray at the temples, the squint from the sun. The jaw tension that was, she noticed, slightly less pronounced than usual. A man who has done the thing he decided to do and found it was right. Coulter. I would have said the same about you. She kept her voice even. If I had been the one standing up, I would have said the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved on the road, the gray's hooves steady in the summer dust. I know, he said. She looked forward, at the road ahead, at the hills in the distance. Good, she said, just making sure. He reached over without looking at her and covered her hand on the seat between them with his. His hand was rough from the work, warm from the summer sun. She turned her palm up the same way she had in the church pew, and he held it, and they rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was the best kind, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. The ranch came over the ridge the way it always did. The house and the barn and the corrals, the windmill turning slow in the afternoon heat, the apple trees, 4 small green shapes along the south wall. It looked the same as it had every other time she'd come over that ridge. It looked completely different. She climbed down from the wagon before he had the horse stopped fully, and she stood in the yard for a moment with the summer heat on her face and the deed in her pocket and the sound of the ranch around her. The horses, the windmill, the birds, the particular quality of wind that came down off the mountain in the afternoons, only here, only at this altitude, only on this piece of ground that was hers now in a way that she could hold in her hands. She pressed her palm flat against the wooden post of the paddock fence, the same way she'd pressed it against the cold dirt around the apple tree in May, remembering, claiming, making it real. Behind her, Coulter was unhitching the gray with the easy competence of a man doing something he'd done 1,000 times, and the sound of the buckles and the horse's quiet breath was the sound of her life. This one, this actual one, the one she had not chosen and had chosen anyway, in every small daily way that choosing actually happens. She did not think of it as perfect. It was not perfect. There were debts in this story, literal and otherwise, that would take longer to settle. There were people in that town who would find new angles. There were things between her and Coulter that had not been said yet and would need to be said when the time for them arrived. The ranch itself would break and demand and exhaust and require, the way it always had, the way this land always did. But she was standing in the yard of 300 acres that had her name on them, next to a man who had stood up in front of an entire town and told the truth. And the afternoon light was coming down long and gold off the western hills, and the apple trees were growing. She let go of the fence post and went to help with the horse. The gossip didn't die overnight. Anyone who expected that, who imagined that one public declaration in a small church on a summer Sunday would silence 20 years of a town's accumulated habit of judgment, didn't understand how gossip actually worked. It didn't die. It retreated. It found smaller rooms to live in, quieter voices to carry it, until eventually it ran out of oxygen and became something else. History. The story of what had happened, rather than the story of what was happening. That process took the rest of the summer. Aveline watched it happen the way she watched most things, with attention, without hurry, without the particular exhausting vigilance of someone who needs a verdict. She went to the supply run the following week and the week after that, and she noticed the changes in how people met her eyes, the small recalibrations that a community makes when it has been shown that it was wrong. Martin Fossey had always been decent, but now he was openly friendly. Vera Lawton of the exceptional apple cake stopped her outside the dry goods to ask about the orchard with genuine curiosity. Old Hector Mills, every time he saw her, tipped his hat in a way that meant something. Others took longer. Some never came around entirely, and she made her peace with that because she was not operating under the illusion that a deed transfer and a church speech fixed everything that had been broken. Life was not a story where the problem resolved clean and everyone learned their lesson and went home better than they came. Real life was messier than that, more gradual, with holdouts and backsliders, and people who simply could not revise a position once they'd staked themselves to it. Agnes Hollis was one of those people. She didn't engage directly again. The frontal approach had failed at the social, and she was too intelligent to repeat it. But she was also not a woman capable of simply dropping something, so what she did instead was subtler, and in some ways more honest. She began treating Aveline with the specific courtesy reserved for people one has decided to acknowledge as legitimate without ever explicitly admitting one was wrong. It was not warmth, it was recognition. And from Agnes Hollis, Aveline had concluded recognition was probably the most that was available, and she accepted it for what it was. What she had not expected was Della Pryor. Della came to the ranch in August. She came alone, driving herself in the small Pryor family buggy, and she came on a Tuesday afternoon when she would have known Coulter was working the north pasture. Aveline saw the buggy from the kitchen window and stood there for a moment, drying her hands, working out what this visit was. She went to the door. Della looked different outside the context of Agnes's company. Smaller, somehow, and more uncertain, the wide, pleasant eyes less calculated and, more simply, anxious. She held a jar covered in cloth, and she held it with both hands. "I brought preserves," she said. "Plum. I heard you have an orchard starting, and I thought—" She stopped. "That's not why I came." "Come in," Aveline said. She put on coffee. Della sat at the kitchen table with the jar still in her hands, looking at the room with the expression of someone making note of what they'd expected versus what they found. "This is nice," Della said. "It's a working kitchen." Della set the jar down. "I thought it would be—" "I don't know what I thought." She looked at Aveline directly for what was possibly the first time in their acquaintance. "I came to apologize." Aveline poured the coffee, set a cup in front of Della, sat across from her. "For what specifically?" For listening to Agnes, for standing there that day at the social and not—" She pressed her lips together. "I didn't say anything to her. After. When you walked away. I should have." "Yes," Aveline said. "You should have." Della absorbed that without flinching, which elevated her slightly in Aveline's estimation. A person who comes to apologize and can't receive a straightforward acknowledgement that they were wrong hasn't actually come to apologize. They've come to feel better about themselves. Della stayed with it. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." Aveline looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes?" "Why now?" "It's been 2 months since Coulter spoke at the service." "Why not then?" Della was quiet for a moment, turning the coffee cup in her hands. "Because then I was embarrassed. I was sitting there in that church and I was embarrassed for my part in it, and I wanted it to go away." She looked up. "It took me a while to realize that wanting it to go away wasn't the same as making it right." That was, Aveline thought, one of the more honest things anyone had said to her in a long time. "All right," she said. "Thank you for coming." Della stayed for an hour. They talked about the orchard, the apple varieties, the slow first-year growth, the expectation of fruit in 2 to 3 years, and about the ranch generally, and about Della's own garden, which had been failing for years due to a drainage problem she didn't know how to fix. Aveline told her about the south slope drainage she'd done in the spring and what had worked. It was not the beginning of a friendship exactly, but it was a conversation between 2 women who were seeing each other clearly, maybe for the first time, which was its own kind of thing. When Della left, Aveline stood in the yard watching the buggy go and thought about what it meant. Not just the apology, but the mechanism of it. The slow grinding work of a community correcting itself. It was not impressive as processes went. It was halting and partial and driven more by social pressure than genuine reckoning. But it was real. And it was happening, and she'd take real and imperfect over nothing at all. Elias Mercer came to the ranch for the first time in September. He came on a Saturday, in the farm wagon, with Ruth and Dell, and what appeared to be most of a smoked ham. He stood in the yard looking at the property with the eyes of a man who had made a decision and was now seeing fully what that decision had led to. What his daughter had built in the space he'd handed her. Coulter met him in the yard. The 2 men shook hands. It was not a warm handshake. There was too much history between them for warmth to come easily. The particular weight of the debt cleared, the arrangement made. The daughter signed over in a way that still sat between them like an old injury that had healed imperfectly. but it was solid. Men who are fundamentally decent and have done something complicated to each other can sometimes manage solid when warmth is not yet available. Good property, Elias said. It does all right, Coulter said. Her father looked at the barn, the corrals, the garden, the 4 apple trees along the south wall. His gaze lingered on the trees. He knew she had planted them. Her mother had told him. She planned to put in an orchard at the home place, he said. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. When she was about 14, 15, drew up the whole thing, where each tree would go, what varieties. I know, Coulter said. She told me. Elias looked at him. She keeps a garden log, Coulter said. She's been tracking the growth measurements on each tree since they went in. Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. That's Aveline. Yes, Coulter said simply. It is. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly. Not the kind that arrives with a clean sensation of release. More like an acknowledgement. 2 men understanding that what had been done between them had led somewhere neither of them had entirely predicted, and that where it had led was good, and that good was its own complicated answer to a complicated question. Aveline watched it from the kitchen window. She did not go out immediately. She gave them a moment she thought they needed without her in it. Then she put the coffee on and went to the door and called them in. The day her family spent at the ranch was the most ordinary day she could remember having in a long time. Ruth and Aveline cooked together in the kitchen. Her mother kept stopping to look at things, the way the shelves were organized, the garden log on the counter, the heavy-duty work gloves hanging by the back door. And didn't say much, but the quality of her mother's silence was the satisfied kind, the kind that says this is right without needing to speak it. Dell attached himself to Coulter the way he'd done in May, asking about the horses, and this time Coulter actually took him out and put him on Tuesday and walked him around the paddock, instructing him with the same focused attention he'd given Aveline the previous winter. She watched from the fence and felt something that was not quite a word, something about family, about what family actually was versus what you were born into, about how it was possible to build things that had not existed before. At the table that evening, all 5 of them, the smoked ham and the potatoes and the last of the summer tomatoes, her father raised his coffee cup and looked at her across the table. Not a toast, not a speech, just a look, father to daughter, carrying everything that was between them. The debt, the arrangement, the wrongness of it, the complicated outcome, the love that had never stopped being there even when it was behaving badly. She raised her cup. He nodded. That was enough. Patron? The first hard frost came in October. She was ready for it. The garden beds covered and the root vegetables in. The orchard trees wrapped at the base with straw, the way the almanac specified for young trees in their first winters. She'd spent 2 evenings the week before doing it herself, Coulter holding the lamp while she worked her way down the row in the early dark. They'll be all right, he said. They'd better be. I've put enough work into them. First winter is always the hardest. She looked up at him from where she was kneeling at the 4th tree. For orchards? For most things. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to the straw. The first winter had been the hardest. She knew that. She knew it with the specific knowledge of a person who had lived through a thing rather than just understood it in theory. The early mornings in the cold, the locked door, the burned biscuits on the wedding morning, the church walk with 200 pairs of eyes on her back, the particular loneliness of being in a strange house with a man she didn't know yet. She did not romanticize it. It had been hard and cold, and there had been nights she'd lain in the dark and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd lost, the life she'd planned, the exits that were closed, the version of herself she hadn't gotten to become. But here is what she had come to understand about that loss. The thing she could not have seen from inside it. It had not been replaced by something lesser. It had been replaced by something she couldn't have designed for herself because it required being in the specific pressure of those specific circumstances to become the person capable of inhabiting it. The self she was now. The woman who rode 1,200 acres and planted trees and told Agnes Hollis the truth and held a deed in her coat pocket was built from the hard winter. She could not have arrived here by an easier road. That was not a comfortable truth. She was not going to stand in a yard and tell people their suffering was secretly good for them. because that was a lie that people told to make other people's pain convenient. The arrangement had been wrong. Her father had been wrong to agree without her knowing. Coulter had been wrong not to find a better way. These things were true and they stayed true. And also, she was here. She had made it hers. Both things, simultaneously, without either canceling the other. She had thought about this enough to have an opinion on it, which was that life was not a simple story where the lessons were clean and the outcomes were proportional and everything balanced out in the end. Life was a complicated story where wrong things happened, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the person who lived through them found a way to make something real on the other side. That was not a guarantee. It was not a consolation. It was just what she had found on the other side of the worst year of her life, and she held it as a true thing without requiring it to be a lesson that applied to anyone else. The night she told Coulter she loved him, it was November again. Almost exactly a year from the wedding. She had not planned it. She was not a woman who staged emotional moments. The planning of them required a kind of theatrical self-consciousness she had never possessed. It happened the way real things happened, which was in the middle of an ordinary evening that had no particular claim to significance. They were at the table after supper. He was reading. She was going through the garden log, making notes for the spring, thinking about what she wanted to add to the south beds. The fire was going. The ranch was making its evening sounds around them. The sound she knew as well as she knew her own heartbeat now, that had become the ambient sound of her life. She looked up from the log. She looked at him. The reading glasses, the lamp, the book held in both hands, the jaw tension that had become, over the year, something she felt a proprietary concern about. The gray at his temples had spread slightly. The bent left arm of the glasses had not been fixed. There was a small scar on the back of his right hand from a wire repair in July that she had cleaned and bandaged herself, sitting at this table, while he tried to tell her it was fine and she told him it wasn't. She loved him with the plain, unglamorous, daily love of someone who had watched a person be themselves completely over a long time and found the whole of it, the difficult parts and the good parts and the parts that were neither, worth staying for. Coulter. He looked up. "I love you," she said. The way she said true things, directly, without preamble, without the softening that would have made it smaller than it was. He was still for a moment. The book stayed in his hands. His face did the thing it rarely did, moved through something complex and visible, something she didn't try to read too quickly because it deserved the time it needed. Then he set the book down on the side table. "I know," he said. She almost laughed. "That's your response." "I've known it for a while." He looked at her with those steady eyes. "I was waiting for you to know it too." "How long?" He thought about it. "May," he said. "When you planted the trees." She looked at him. "You didn't say anything." "It wasn't mine to say first." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "It needed to be yours. Same as everything else here needed to be yours." She sat with that for a moment. The fire crackled. The ranch breathed around them. "I love you," he said then, quietly, the way he said things that cost him something. Not decorated, not performed, just the truth, offered the same way he'd offered the key on the washstand and the Christmas gloves and the deed in the church, with the straightforward decency of a man who had decided what was right, and did it without making a production of himself. She got up from her chair and crossed the room and sat beside him on the bench near the fire. He made room without being asked. She leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the warmth, looking at the fire. It was not a grand moment. The house still needed work on the north side eaves. The apple trees were young and uncertain and might not survive a hard enough winter. There were people in Redstone Valley who would never fully revise their opinion. Elias Mercer still had not said directly to Aveline what she knew he felt, and might never find the language for it. The ranch would demand everything they had every year for the foreseeable future, and some years it would demand more than they had, and they'd have to find it anyway. None of that was resolved. None of it was clean. But she was sitting by the fire in November, in the second year of a marriage she had not chosen, with a man she had chosen every single day since she understood what choosing actually meant, not the grand gesture, not the single moment of decision, but the daily small repeated acts of showing up and staying and doing the work, and being honest and trying again. That was love. Not the version from the novels, not the breathless rearranging of everything. The version that existed in the ordinary evening, the coffee at 4:30, the gloves that fit, the lamp by the chair. She pressed closer to his side and he held her, and the fire did what fires do, and the ranch settled around them for the night. Outside, the first snow of the second winter was coming down off the mountain. She could hear the particular quality of silence that snow brought, the way it muffled the world and made the space inside feel more itself. The apple trees were wrapped and waiting. The horses were in and fed. The garden was put to bed. The deed was in the top drawer of the chest in the bedroom, next to the iron key she no longer used and kept anyway, because some things you kept not because you needed them, but because they were true. She had come to this house with one bag and a borrowed dress and a determination to survive. She had stayed because it became her home. The difference between those two things, between surviving and staying, was not a dramatic one. It didn't happen in a single moment or announce itself with any fanfare. It happened in the accumulation of ordinary days, in the decision made quietly and repeatedly to be present in the life she had, instead of mourning the one she hadn't gotten. It happened because a man had offered her a key and let her decide whether to use it, and because she had been stubborn and clear-eyed enough to see what was real instead of what was comfortable to believe. She was not a tragic story. She was not a lucky one either. She was a person who had been put in an impossible position and had found, in that position, something true about herself. What she could bear, what she could build,